They called him the first gentleman of England, yet he died like a bloated beast, screaming for his physician in the dark hours before dawn. George IV, Prince, Regent, King, had spent 67 years cultivating an image of refined elegance, of cultural sophistication, that would define an entire era. His court glittered with the finest art, the most exquisite fashions, the most dazzling architectural wonders that money could buy. He was the patron of Jane Austen's world, the living embodiment of Regency splendor. But on that June morning in 1830, as servants found him slumped in his specially fitted chair, unable to lie flat for months, weighing nearly 20 stone and blind in one eye, the truth was inescapable. This was how absolute power dies, not in glory, not in battle, not even in peaceful slumber, but in a haze of laudanum and bodily decay, crying out for help that would never come in time. David Wilkie had reported that the king was wasting away frightfully day after day, transformed into something that looked like a great sausage stuffed into the covering. The man who had once dazzled Europe with his wit and charm had become a prisoner in his own corrupted flesh, sustained only by increasing doses of opium that left him in a drugged and mentally impaired state for days on end. How did a child born into such promise become history's most pitiable king? George Augustus Frederick entered the world on August 12, 1762, at St. James's Palace, heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. His birth was greeted with cannon fire and church bells, the promise of dynastic continuity after his grandfather, George II's long reign. The infant prince was destined to inherit not just a kingdom, but an empire upon which the sun never set, stretching from the Caribbean sugar islands to the spice routes of India. His father, George III, was still a young king of 24, earnest and devoted to duty, while his mother, Queen Charlotte, brought Germanic propriety and intellectual curiosity to the court. The royal nursery at Kew Palace became a haven of learning, where the future king was surrounded by the finest tutors, the most beautiful toys, and the constant attention of devoted servants who hung on his every word and gesture. Young George was undeniably gifted. He possessed a quick wit that delighted the court, an ear for languages that impressed foreign diplomats, and an artistic sensibility that would later reshape British culture. At 5 years old, he could charm visiting dignitaries with his precocious conversation. By 10, he was fluent in French, German, and Italian, could discuss philosophy with his tutors, and displayed an instinctive understanding of art and beauty that marked him as truly exceptional. The nation watched this golden child with genuine affection and mounting expectations. Here was a prince who seemed destined to combine the intellectual vigor of an enlightened monarch with the cultural refinement of a Renaissance patron. Foreign courts sent their most accomplished ambassadors to assess this remarkable heir, returning home with reports of a boy who seemed to embody all the promise of modern kingship. Even his rebellions were charming in those early years, a spirited independence that suggested strength of character rather than dangerous willfulness. When he argued with his tutors or showed preference for certain courtiers, observers smiled indulgently at such signs of a naturally commanding personality. The British people had found their future king, and he was everything they could have hoped for. But admiration would soon turn to manipulation, and promise would curdle into something far more dangerous. The first poison entered through privilege itself. While other children learned through play and friendship, George was educated in isolation, surrounded by adults whose livelihoods depended entirely on his favor. His tutors, learned men like Bishop Hurd and the Reverend Dr. Cyril Jackson, were brilliant scholars, but they were also courtiers who understood that their careers hinged on pleasing their royal pupil. Rather than truly educating him, every whim was indulged, every preference validated. If the young prince grew bored with the Latin, the lesson shifted to something more appealing. If he showed displeasure at criticism, the criticism vanished. What began as educational flexibility slowly transformed into a system where George's desires became the organizing principle of his entire world. The very people meant to shape his character, instead, shaped themselves around his emerging personality, creating a feedback loop that amplified his natural charisma into something approaching narcissism. His father, George III, well-meaning but increasingly distant, established rigid protocols that inadvertently reinforced young George's sense of divine separation from ordinary humanity. The prince ate alone or with carefully selected companions, never experiencing the rough-and-tumble equality of childhood friendship. His social interactions were choreographed performances where everyone knew their subordinate role in advance. More insidiously, George began to learn that charm could substitute for discipline, that wit could deflect accountability, and that his natural gifts exempted him from the ordinary rules that governed lesser mortals. When he displayed his considerable intelligence, adults gasped with admiration. When he showed artistic sensitivity, they proclaimed him a genius. When he expressed opinions, however half-formed, courtiers nodded sagely and praised his wisdom. The boy, who had once been merely gifted, began to see himself as exceptional in ways that transcended normal human limitations. Literature and philosophy, instead of broadening his perspective, became tools for reinforcing his sense of superiority. He developed an early fascination with absolute monarchs like Louis XIV, drawn not to their achievements, but to their power to reshape reality according to their personal vision. Perhaps most damaging was the gradual erosion of any authentic emotional connections. His relationships became transactional. Adults sought his favor. He dispensed approval or displeasure. Love became confused with deference, friendship with flattery. The natural empathy that might have tempered his growing self-absorption was systematically starved by a court structure that made him the center of every interaction. By adolescence, George had internalized a worldview both brilliant and poisonous. He was not merely a prince, but a superior being whose personal happiness was cosmically significant. His pleasures were aesthetic achievements. His displeasures were moral failings in others. His desires were inherently justified by his own divine nature. The foundation was set for a life where increasing power would meet decreasing resistance, where every impulse would be enabled by those too dependent or too frightened to say no. This child would soon inherit more than just ideas. He would inherit power. The transformation began not with a crown, but with a crisis. In 1811, when George was 48, his father's mind finally shattered completely. During what would be George III's final descent into madness, the king who had once guided his son's education now wandered the corridors of Windsor Castle, blind and raving, lost in delusions that would never lift. Parliament, faced with an ungovernable monarch, had no choice but to pass the Regency Act, formally transferring power to the Prince of Wales. George had spent decades anticipating this moment, chafing under his father's authority while accumulating debts, mistresses, and a reputation for spectacular excess. Now, at last, the leash was cut. He was no longer merely the heir. He was the regent, wielding the full authority of the crown, while his father lived on as a pitiable shadow. The ceremony was subdued by royal standards, reflecting the nation's ambivalence about their new ruler. George took the oath of regency in a room at Carlton House, surrounded by politicians who eyed him with barely concealed anxiety. They had watched his extravagances for years, his secret marriage to the Catholic Mrs. Fitzherbert, his disastrous official marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, his mounting debts that required repeated parliamentary bailouts. Now this man held absolute power. But power suited George in ways that surprised even his critics. He threw himself into the role with renewed energy, displaying a flair for statecraft that had been hidden beneath years of dissolute behavior. His genuine artistic vision began to reshape London itself, commissioning John Nash to transform Regent Street and the Royal Pavilion at Brighton into architectural wonders that would define the age. His patronage of arts and letters created a cultural flowering that made Britain the envy of Europe. Yet there were troubling signs from the beginning. His spending increased exponentially now that he controlled the royal purse. His treatment of Queen Caroline grew more vindictive, culminating in his attempts to exclude her from his eventual coronation. Most ominously, his appetites for food, for drink, for luxury, for flattery, seemed to expand in direct proportion to his power. The courtiers who had once indulged a troublesome prince now found themselves enabling a regent whose whims carried the force of law. With power came purity, at any cost. When George III finally died in January 1820, the Prince Regent ascended to the throne as George IV at 57, but his coronation would become a battlefield that revealed the depths of his capacity for cruelty. His estranged wife, Caroline, who had spent years in continental exile amid rumors of affairs and scandal, chose this moment to return to England and claim her rights as queen consort. What followed was a public humiliation so vicious it shocked even Georgian society. George's response was swift and merciless. He commanded British ambassadors across Europe to ensure that foreign courts would not recognize Caroline as queen. Her name was struck from the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy of the Church of England, as if she could be erased from existence by royal decree. When she appeared at Westminster Abbey for the coronation ceremony in July 1821, the doors were literally slammed in her face by guards acting on the king's explicit orders. But Caroline's public rejection was merely the opening act. George's true innovation lay in transforming personal vindictiveness into state policy. He initiated divorce proceedings that required Parliament to investigate the most intimate details of their marriage, including his own extensive adultery, creating a spectacle that dominated public attention for months. The proceedings revealed a monarch who viewed the machinery of government as an extension of his personal will, willing to weaponize the Constitution itself to settle private grievances. The trial became a mirror for George's evolving relationship with opposition. When crowds gathered to support Caroline, he saw not legitimate dissent, but personal betrayal. When newspapers criticized his treatment of her, he interpreted it as an attack on the monarchy itself. His circle of advisors began to narrow, excluding anyone who showed insufficient enthusiasm for his campaigns of personal vengeance. More troubling still was his growing conviction that his desires possessed moral authority simply because they were his. The same artistic sensibility that had created architectural masterpieces now manifested as an aesthetic of power, where beauty meant the elimination of anything that displeased him. His court became a carefully curated environment where Caroline's very existence was treated as a form of aesthetic pollution that required cleansing. The king's physicians began to notice disturbing changes in his behavior during this period. His eating became compulsive, his drinking excessive even by the standards of Georgian excess. Dr. Matthew Bailey noted that George seemed driven by an insatiable appetite for admiration that required constantly increasing doses of flattery to satisfy. When courtiers failed to provide sufficient praise, his rages could last for hours. By the time Caroline died in August 1821, amid whispered suggestions of poison that were never investigated, George had established a new template for royal authority. Opposition was not merely political disagreement, but personal affront. Criticism was not democratic discourse, but treasonous conspiracy. Resistance was not principled dissent, but moral failure. But belief alone wasn't enough. Control required enforcement. George's genius lay not in creating new instruments of oppression, but in corrupting existing ones until they served his pathological need for validation. The court that had once been merely sycophantic became actively predatory, with courtiers competing to anticipate and eliminate anything that might displease their increasingly unstable monarch. Sir William Knighton, his private secretary and closest confidant, emerged as the architect of what amounted to a surveillance state in miniature. Knighton established networks of informants throughout the royal household, monitoring servants' conversations, intercepting correspondence, and maintaining detailed files on anyone who might pose a threat to the king's emotional equilibrium. Staff members learned to report on each other's loyalty, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that extended from scullery maids to cabinet ministers. The king's famous temper tantrums, once dismissed as aristocratic petulance, evolved into calculated instruments of terror. George discovered that his rages could literally paralyze the machinery of government, as ministers scrambled to appease him rather than risk triggering an explosion that might last for days. Lord Liverpool, his long-serving prime minister, developed what observers described as a nervous twitch that appeared whenever the king's mood shifted toward displeasure. More insidious was George's deployment of what he called aesthetic correction, the systematic elimination of people, places, and even memories that contradicted his version of reality. Portraits of Caroline were removed not just from public spaces, but from private homes of courtiers who wished to remain in favor. Books that contained unflattering references to the royal family mysteriously disappeared from libraries. Servants who had witnessed embarrassing episodes found themselves reassigned to remote estates or dismissed entirely. The king's physicians became unwitting enforcers of this system. Dr. Henry Halford, who would later oversee George's final decline, learned to diagnose political dissent as mental illness, recommending rest cures for courtiers whose loyalty seemed questionable. The royal medical staff developed elaborate theories about the health risks of negative thinking, prescribing exile from court as treatment for anyone who failed to display sufficient enthusiasm for the king's increasingly erratic behavior. George's relationship with money became another tool of control. He weaponized his debts, using financial crises to force Parliament into greater submission, while simultaneously deploying royal patronage like a drug dealer managing addiction. Artists, architects, and writers found themselves dependent on royal commissions that could be withdrawn at any moment, creating a cultural establishment that existed in a state of permanent anxiety about the king's approval. The most chilling innovation was George's treatment of memory itself. He began to issue what amounted to royal edits of history, demanding that official records be altered to reflect his preferred version of events. The Caroline affair was gradually rewritten in court documents, until she appeared not as a wronged wife, but as a foreign conspirator. His own youthful indiscretions were systematically erased from official chronicles, replaced by hagiographic accounts of princely virtue. By 1825, the court had become a machine designed to generate a single product, the illusion of George's perfection. Every conversation was performance, every interaction was theater, every relationship was calculated to reinforce the king's increasingly fragile sense of his own magnificence. The line between reality and fantasy had not merely blurred, it had been systematically destroyed by royal decree. Those who served this system found themselves transformed by it, their capacity for independent thought slowly strangled by the constant need to anticipate and appease their master's psychological requirements. The culture of fear that surrounded George extended outward in concentric circles, corrupting everything it touched. No one was spared, not even family. The final test of George's capacity for human connection came through his relationship with his only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte. Beloved by the nation as the hope for dynastic renewal, Charlotte possessed an independence of spirit that her father found increasingly intolerable. She dared to question his treatment of her mother Caroline, maintained correspondence with relatives he had banished, and worst of all, formed genuine friendships based on affection rather than calculation. George's response was to treat his daughter's autonomy as a form of treason. He intercepted her letters, dismissed servants who showed her excessive loyalty, and attempted to control her marriage prospects with a micromanagement that bordered on obsession. When Charlotte expressed preferences that contradicted his wishes, he would fly into rages that left her trembling and confused, unable to understand how paternal love could manifest as such systematic cruelty. The breaking point came when Charlotte chose to marry Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg against her father's initial preferences. George's eventual acquiescence came only after he extracted humiliating concessions that reduced his daughter to tears during the negotiations. He insisted on controlling every detail of the wedding, transforming what should have been a celebration into a demonstration of his absolute authority over even the most intimate aspects of his family's lives. When Charlotte died in childbirth in November 1817, giving birth to a stillborn son, George's grief revealed the true poverty of his emotional landscape. Rather than mourning his daughter, he mourned the loss of dynastic continuity. Rather than reflecting on their relationship, he raged about the unfairness of fate. His public displays of sorrow were carefully choreographed performances designed to generate sympathy for himself rather than honor Charlotte's memory. More chilling still was his treatment of Maria Fitzherbert, the woman he had secretly and illegally married in 1785. For over 3 decades, she had been his most consistent emotional anchor. The one person who had known him before power completely corrupted his capacity for genuine affection. But as his paranoia deepened, even Maria became suspect. He began to interpret her concerns about his health and behavior as evidence of disloyalty, her attempts to reason with him as conspiracies against his authority. By 1820, George had systematically severed every relationship that might have provided honest feedback about his deteriorating condition. His brothers, once close companions in rebellion against their father, found themselves reduced to supplicants who communicated through intermediaries. His few remaining friends were those who had learned to function as professional flatterers, their survival dependent on never contradicting the king's increasingly disconnected perception of reality. The isolation was nearly complete. George IV, surrounded by hundreds of courtiers and thousands of subjects, had achieved a loneliness so profound that it began to manifest in his physical form. But the human body has limits, even when the will does not. The transformation began subtly, manifesting first as what courtiers politely termed increased appetite. By 1828, George's legendary indulgence had crossed the line into something approaching medical emergency. The king, who had once been praised as handsome, now required specially constructed chairs to support his enormous bulk. David Wilkie, observing him at court, reported with barely concealed horror that His Majesty was wasting away frightfully day after day, yet paradoxically growing ever more massive until he resembled a great sausage stuffed into the covering. The laudanum had started innocently enough, prescribed for the severe bladder pains that racked his oversized frame. But George's relationship with the opium-based tincture quickly evolved from medical necessity into psychological dependency. By 1829, he was consuming over 100 drops before any public appearance, transforming state occasions into surreal performances where a drugged monarch attempted to maintain royal dignity while barely conscious. His physicians watched in fascination and horror as their patient's body began to betray the mind that commanded it. Sir Henry Halford, his primary doctor, noted that George's constitution seemed gigantic, not in health, but in its capacity to absorb punishment that would have killed ordinary men. The king's breakfast alone would have satisfied 3 normal adults: a pigeon and beef steak pie, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy, followed inevitably by massive doses of laudanum. The drug's effects created a grotesque parody of the artistic sensibility that had once been George's greatest asset. Under opium's influence, he would issue architectural orders for impossible buildings, commission portraits of people who existed only in his hallucinations, and conduct lengthy conversations with courtiers who had been dead for years. His servants learned to nod respectfully, while the king described elaborate plans for military campaigns against countries that had never existed. More disturbing were the physical manifestations of his decay. By December 1828, George was almost completely blind from cataracts, his once keen eyes clouded to useless orbs. Severe gout had twisted his right hand into a claw that could no longer hold a pen, forcing him to approve legislation through stamped signatures applied by trembling servants. His legs, swollen with fluid retention, had become hard as stone. requiring regular puncturing to drain the accumulating poison from his bloated tissues. The king's bedchamber became a medical theater of horrors. Dropsy forced him to sleep upright in a specially constructed chair, his enormous head lolling forward onto a table placed strategically to catch his weight. His breathing, labored and irregular, filled the room with sounds that servants described as resembling a dying animal. Doctors frequently tapped his abdomen like vintners testing wine casks, draining quarts of fluid that would mysteriously reappear within days. Yet perhaps most terrifying was the preservation of his mental acuity beneath this physical ruin. George remained intellectually sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening to his body, to observe his own decay with the same aesthetic judgment he had once applied to art and architecture. He spoke with chilling clarity about his transformation, describing himself as blind as a beetle, while maintaining enough vanity to demand mirrors be removed from his presence. The man who had spent a lifetime believing himself above human limitations was discovering that flesh recognizes no royal prerogatives. Death was near, but the ruler's grip had not yet loosened. In May 1830, sensing the approach of his end, George dictated his final will with the same meticulous control that had characterized his entire reign. Even facing death, he could not resist one last performance of absolute authority, specifying not only the distribution of his possessions, but attempting to orchestrate his own posthumous reputation. The document revealed the mind still desperately concerned with image management, still convinced that reality could be commanded into compliance with his desires. His spiritual awakening came too late and too calculated to provide genuine comfort. George confessed to an archdeacon that he repented of his dissolute life, but immediately qualified this admission with hope that mercy would be shown to him, as he had always tried to do the best for his subjects. Even in confession, he could not resist justifying himself, transforming repentance into another form of self-promotion. The laudanum that had become his constant companion now controlled his final days completely. Sir Henry Halford privately informed his wife that things are coming to a conclusion, yet publicly maintained the fiction of royal dignity through medical bulletins that the Lancet would later condemn as utterly and entirely destitute of information. The king's physicians had become accomplices in a final deception, protecting George's vanity even as his body surrendered to forces beyond royal command. His last coherent obsession centered on Maria Fitzherbert, the woman whose love he had systematically destroyed through decades of paranoia and control. In moments of drug-induced clarity, George would demand updates on her condition, issue orders for her comfort, and dictate letters that revealed the emotional wreckage beneath his imperial facade. These communications, desperate and incoherent, showed a man finally understanding what his need for absolute control had cost him. The king's final weeks were spent in his specially fitted chair, unable to lie flat, his breathing so labored that servants could hear it throughout the castle. His friend Sir Jonathan Wathen Waller maintained vigil, holding George's hand through the long nights as the monarch drifted between consciousness and opium dreams. Even in extremis, George required constant attendance, his terror of abandonment so profound that he could not bear to be alone even for minutes. On the night of June 25, 1830, George managed to fall asleep in his chair, his forehead resting on one hand while Wathen Waller held the other. For a few hours, the man who had spent 67 years demanding absolute control finally surrendered to forces greater than royal will. But the moment he died, the world began to shift. At approximately 3 in the morning on June 26, 1830, George awoke from his drugged sleep to pass what would be his final bowel movement, a large evacuation mixed with blood. The symbolism was too perfect for the scribes who would later record this moment. The king who had consumed everything was finally expelling the poison that had sustained him. He called for Sir Henry Halford with his last breath. "Sir Henry! Sir Henry! Fetch him! This is death!" The physician arrived too late. George IV was found slumped in his chair, his features neither drawn nor distorted, but wearing what observers described as serene and tranquil expression, as if death had provided the peace that a lifetime of absolute power had failed to deliver. His cheeks appeared somewhat sunken, his abdomen raised like a grotesque monument to his appetites, but for the first time in years, his face showed no trace of the rage that had defined his final decade. The collapse of his carefully constructed reality began within hours. Sir William Knighton, the private secretary who had orchestrated George's surveillance apparatus, found himself suddenly powerless as courtiers who had lived in terror for years began to speak freely about their experiences. The networks of informants and enforcers that had maintained the king's version of truth simply evaporated without his personality to sustain them. Parliament, which had spent a decade walking on eggshells around George's volatile moods, experienced something approaching collective relief. The Duke of Wellington, who had navigated the king's rages with the same tactical skill he had applied to military campaigns, privately admitted that governing had become nearly impossible under a monarch whose emotional instability could paralyze state business for weeks at a time. Most tellingly, the elaborate systems George had created to manage his image proved utterly dependent on his living will to enforce them. Within days, servants were sharing stories that contradicted decades of official narratives. The carefully curated version of royal history began to crumble as those who had been silenced by fear rediscovered their voices. His brother William, ascending to the throne as William IV, inherited not a functioning monarchy but a court culture so corrupted by George's pathological need for control that it would take years to restore normal human relationships to the royal household. What history would remember was now up for grabs. The first obituaries revealed a nation struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The Times delivered perhaps the harshest verdict ever rendered on a British monarch. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow low creatures than this deceased king. Yet even this brutal assessment seemed inadequate to capture the full scope of George's transformation from promising prince to pathetic tyrant. Medical historians would later diagnose his final years as a textbook case of laudanum addiction, complicated by what modern physicians recognize as congestive heart failure and severe obesity. Sir Astley Cooper's autopsy revealed ossification of the valves of the aorta that had existed for years, transforming George's heart into a hardened organ incapable of sustaining the massive bulk it was forced to supply. The poetic justice was inescapable. The man who had hardened his heart against human connection had literally developed a heart of stone. Victorian moralists seized upon George's story as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power and sensual indulgence. They portrayed him as a monster of appetite, whose downfall proved the superiority of their own restrained values. But this interpretation missed the more disturbing truth. George had not been born evil, but had been systematically shaped by systems that eliminated every check on his worst impulses. 20th century psychologists would recognize in George's behavior patterns consistent with what they termed narcissistic personality disorder, complicated by substance abuse and the unique pressures of absolute monarchy. His need for constant validation, his inability to tolerate criticism, his systematic destruction of genuine relationships all pointed to a man whose psychological development had been arrested by the very privilege meant to prepare him for kingship. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that George's particular form of tyranny had been enabled not by dramatic acts of oppression, but by the gradual corruption of ordinary human interactions. He had not needed dungeons or executioners. He had simply weaponized charm, wealth, and social dependence until everyone around him became complicit in maintaining his delusions. The Duke of Wellington's private assessment proved most prescient. George had been a magnificent patron of the arts, whose aesthetic sensibility had been fatally corrupted by power's tendency to transform everything, including human relationships, into objects for manipulation and control. But what did this life truly mean? For power, for humanity? George IV's terrifying final days illuminate a truth more unsettling than simple tyranny. The The most dangerous corruption of power lies not in its dramatic abuses, but in its subtle transformation of ordinary human virtues into instruments of control. His tragedy was not that he became a monster, but that he remained recognizably human while systematically destroying everything that makes humanity bearable. The gift of aesthetic sensibility that should have enriched the world became a tool for eliminating anything that contradicted his vision of perfection. The intelligence that should have fostered wisdom became a weapon for justifying increasingly irrational demands. The charm that should have created genuine connections became a technique for manufacturing dependency and fear. Every quality that had once marked him as exceptional became perverted by the absence of any force capable of saying no. Perhaps most chilling is the recognition that George's system of control required no violence, no dramatic oppression, only the patient corruption of ordinary social relationships, until everyone around him became complicit in maintaining his delusions. His courtiers were not beaten into submission. They were gradually taught that their survival depended on anticipating and enabling his pathologies. His physicians did not conspire to poison him. They simply learned that their professional success required treating his emotional needs as medical emergencies. The laudanum that killed him becomes a perfect metaphor for power itself. Initially medicinal, ultimately addictive, requiring ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect, and finally transforming the user into something barely recognizable as human. George's final image, bloated, blind, unable to lie down, sustained only by drugs that clouded his judgment while preserving his awareness of his own decay, serves as a warning about what happens when human beings are placed beyond the reach of ordinary moral constraints. His death reminds us that mortality remains democracy's final argument against absolute power. The king who spent his life believing himself exempt from human limitations discovered that flesh recognizes no royal prerogatives. In the end, George IV died as he had lived, demanding control over forces that acknowledged no earthly authority. The question that haunts us is not why George became what he became, but how many potential Georges walk among us, their tyrannical impulses held in check only by the fragile systems we build to limit power's natural tendency toward absolute corruption.